Joining me today for the interview is Natalie Vardabasso. Natalie is currently the Assessment Instructional Design Lead at Calgary Academy, which is a special education private school in Calgary, Alberta. For the first 6 years of her career, Natalie was a middle school humanities teacher. Natalie is also the host of the EduCrush podcast, which explores the ways that we can all reimagine education with, as she always says, passion and purpose. And we are definitely going to talk about that podcast today. I connected with Natalie, I think about a year ago through one of our All Things Assessment chats on Twitter. And I've had the pleasure of working with Natalie and with her colleagues at Calgary Academy on some of their assessment work. So I'm excited to talk to Natalie today on the podcast. So Natalie, welcome to the Tom Schimmer podcast.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me. I have to say I'm completely honored, truly. I mean, the lineup that you've had on this podcast is most impressive. Thomas Gusky, Katie Novak, Katie White, Nicole Dimich. I mean, to even be included in this lineup, I'm kind of starstruck right now. So thank you for having me.
Wow. Yeah, I'm happy to have you. We've finally completed the pod swap because I've been a guest on your podcast and now you're here on mine. So circle complete. And,
full circle
Natalie, include yourself in impressive guests, because I think what you've done and what you've accomplished and what you're all about in your career is most impressive. And that's why I have you here. But I want to begin today with you, and then we'll talk about the podcast and we'll talk about some of your ideas about reimagining education and all of that. But I want to talk about you, the story of Natalie. So why teaching? Was education always a career focus, or, in high school and all that, or at some point did you discover a passion for education after you graduated from high school and in college?
It was definitely never a passion in high school. That is for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I actually, going back all the way to my K-12 experience, my dad was my principal in high school.
Oh, wow.
And with a last name like Vardabasso, you can't exactly hide. It's not like, oh, Smith. And I'm like, oh, it's a different Smith. Sorry, we're not related. So I felt like very early on, because he was quite this prolific educator and leader, people were pressuring me to be like, oh, you're for sure going to be a teacher, just like your dad. You'll be so good at it. And I have a very stubborn part to my personality. So very early on, I was like, I will never be a teacher. That is not going to happen over my dead body. I am going to be a pop star. I was like, what is the most polar opposite thing I could do? So I went that route for quite a while. I went to musical theater school, did performing arts in Vancouver, and then realized, can't really do a whole lot with that. And so I went back to school and got a literature degree. Still didn't really know what to do with that. So at that point, I went to the promised land of Alberta to make, the money and pay off student loans, and was just bartending and serving. And I really had no idea who I was or what I wanted to do with my life at that point. I was about 24. Yeah. And my dad just threw you like football, so this is for you, a Hail Mary, trying to make it. He threw a Hail Mary and was like, you know what, I'm at the end of my career. He was on a curriculum advisory panel. He met this incredible professor from UBC who was trying a really innovative approach to teacher education. And it was a small little pilot course that they're going to run out of UBCO, University of British Columbia, the Okanagan campus. And he's like, please try it. Just go. I just feel like you're going to love it. You're going to meet this guy. He has a performing arts background. You're so similar. And so I told him, I had this caveat. I was like, I'll give it 1 month. I'll move home. And if I give it a month and I absolutely hate it, that's it. And we're just going to put that to bed and never talk about teaching ever again. And, as the story goes, like 1 week in, I just was like, this is it. This is where I'm meant to be. I love this so much. I didn't realize what education was supposed to be. I was just basing I don't want to teach on what I had experienced. And I was completely lit up by the idea of going into the space as a change agent. And that's where I've been ever since.
It's always interesting when, growing up, how we tend to look at what our parents are doing and almost automatically kind of say, no, not doing that. I'm going to do the opposite. And part of that is forging your own identity, right?
Right.
And
and that's nicer than saying I'm stubborn. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I think part of growing up is figuring out who you are in absence of the shadow of your parents and family and all of that. So I want to ask you about your experience as a teacher so far. You're still relatively early into your career, but and this is going to be a two-part question because I'm really interested in thinking about your perspective. So first, has there been anything about, and maybe there's been more than one thing, but has there been anything about your experience as a teacher so far that has maybe exceeded your expectations, that you are surprised that it turned out to be the way it did?
I think my eyes were pretty wide open going into it because I grew up with a dad who was an educator. So
Mhm.
I knew that it would be insane hours. I knew I'd be taking work home with me. I knew it would kind of dominate my life.
Right.
But what I didn't expect was the feeling you get when you have either a parent or a student who is just overwhelmed with gratitude by something that you don't even realize how profound it was at the time. Like, I work in a special education context. So there is nothing quite like the moment of sitting in a parent teacher interview and the parent across the table, you're showing them evidence of something their kid wrote, and their kid's
Mhm.
never written anything before. They could hardly get 2 words on the paper, and they're crying and they're thanking you. Like, that is something I think is so truly unique to education. I can't imagine there's something similar in different fields. That fulfillment you get from that is,
Right.
it makes it the greatest job in the world, that
Yeah.
alone. Or, a student coming back like 4 or 5 years later, and it was a kid that tried you in middle
Mhm.
school, and
Mm.
you really had to struggle to get them to a place where they were able to just regulate and get through class. And they're graduating now and they're in grade 12 and they're coming to talk to you about what universities they're looking at, and it's such an amazing feeling. Like, I'm not
Yeah.
a parent, but I can imagine that's the closest it would be, is like watching your kid grow
Yeah.
up, right?
Yeah.
um in terms of exceeds, I mean, also the people. Like,
Right.
I knew that I'd like teachers. I mean, family, friends were all teachers, but I
Right.
really didn't realize how amazing educators are until you start working beside them and you're stumbling and you're having a tough day, and they are always there to pick you up. And
Mm.
it really is a sense of camaraderie that I
Mhm.
could never leave. Um, and then the second part of the question, right, is what has.
Well, so the second part would be: has there been anything that's kind of fallen short or disappointed you, or unexpectedly you thought it was going to be? Again, it may not be terrible, but it's just something that
uh,
didn't fulfill your expectations.
yeah. um I think I would say how pervasive the status quo
Mm.
has been a little bit disappointing. Um, Obviously, I went through what I knew was a bit of a different program, and he was very clear, like, I'm sending you out with this knowledge and this mindset. But
Mhm.
he would ask constantly, how are you going to manage when that's not the reality? How are you going to manage? And I was like, of course, that's the reality. Everybody, we all feel the same. We're all talking about it in this program.
Right.
And then you get out into the real world,
Mhm.
and the status quo isn't like something where people just don't want to change and they're like, no, I want to use my textbook and my tests and this is the way
Yeah.
it should be. Like I
Yeah.
said, teachers are incredible people. It's
Mhm.
pervasive because just the workload is so high. There are so many complex demands on teachers. It's almost like this sad pervasiveness where everybody
Yeah.
wants it. Everybody's talking about the education they wish they could be giving their students, but the
Mhm.
reality of the job is making it impossible to get there. And I think that's been a really sad thing to feel,
It
to
is a.
experience. I
Oh
was even
yeah.
someone who went into the classroom and I had these very
Yeah.
blue sky ideas. And before you know it, I'm like printing out my multiple choice Scantrons and getting that textbook out. You're like, what just happened?
Yeah.
But sometimes that's
Yeah.
just the reality. You're in a new grade, you're in a new
Yeah.
content area, and you're drowning.
Yeah.
That's that.
It's survival mode, and I think sometimes we really do stick it to new teachers when they come into the profession and they get kind of the worst course load, or the you know what I
Hmm.
mean, as far as the assignments are concerned. And I think that sometimes those first 5 years are so overwhelming that when you can finally settle into a routine and you finally have your plan and you finally have your resources, you
Hmm.
you want to stick with that for a while because things have been so unsettled in the early. So I don't know what the
Yeah.
exact answer is, but I think somewhere early in the career we have to collectively do a better job of helping teachers transition into the profession,
Hmm.
rather than saying, welcome to teaching, you get the worst sort of course load of all of the teachers. Or the I don't mean worst as in subject, but you get 5 preps that you have to handle, and you've got to do
Hmm.
this, and you're teaching from a cart. I was talking to
Yeah.
I talked with LaVonna Roth a couple of weeks ago, and she said the same thing when she started her career. She didn't even have a classroom. She was on a cart going up the
Yeah.
elevator and trying to get to. So I think we do this to teachers early in the career for sure, and
Yeah.
it's tough to settle in. And it's funny how also I think sometimes we tend to point the finger and say, if it wasn't for them, I think we could be more progressive, when a lot of change can happen
Exactly.
internally, right? So something I have come to know about you, and you've mentioned this already, is your
Hmm.
theater and performing arts background. And I want you to first tell us a little bit about your background. And I have a follow-up question to this, but tell us a little more about the backstory of Nat becoming a pop star or being a performing artist. Let's talk about that for a moment, and then I'll follow up with the question.
Nat the pop star. I had that whole dream planned out. Let me tell you, I was going to have a clothing line called Envy. Get it? My initials. Yeah, it was the whole dream. Anyways, but that my performing arts love really started. Like I can't even name the age that it started. Just like my earliest memories were always me in front of my parents or their friends with like something resembling a microphone, probably like a hairbrush or whatever, performing or like gathering all the neighborhood kids to put together dances to songs that we would force our parents to watch. I had the entire Spice Girls tour VHS memorized. And every time my parents had a dinner party, I'd be like, to the living room, right? They're like, here we go. So it's just something that's a part of my soul, I think. But anyway, so I followed like a pretty normal trajectory for a lot of kids. I like started in dance, ballet, and then it expanded to like jazz and tap and lots of other forms. And then by about junior high, I was doing external training with like more classical acting and Shakespeare. And by high school, I was a full-blown theater nerd. Pride. I found it definitely was my community. That was the first time I'd had a sense of community. And again, broke my dad's heart many times throughout my life, I think. Because he's an athlete, my mom's an athlete. They had me on sports teams and I'd constantly have to miss practices and stuff because I'd be in shows and dances and plays and eventually had to quit those altogether to make the jump. So by the time I graduated, I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And I was working at a grocery store. And I was actually pretty content. I was like, oh, this is really peaceful. Like, beep. I could just daydream. And so I decided to join a studio that had just opened up in Vernon, BC, where I'm from. It was a couple that had met at Juilliard in New York and they'd moved to Vernon, of all places. And they started an opera and musical theater studio. So I really started to amp up the voice and the more triple threat type of performance. And that kind of parlayed itself into I got a scholarship from the Vernon Performing Arts Center to go pursue this outside of Vernon, my little bubble. And I got accepted to the Capilano Musical Theater program and did that for a few years. I actually didn't finish the diploma. I dropped out because I got to a point where I realized I loved performing so much. And the depth that you get to at a university level program is pretty exciting. But I felt more lost than I ever was before it even started. And I always thought that was such a key part of who I was. But I quickly realized that reading scripts and trying to step inside other people and focusing on that a lot, I hadn't taken any time to actually figure out who I was, what I valued, what I wanted, what I cared about. Was there a cause I wanted to change? Like I had no idea. And so that caused me to leave. And now I just dance for fun, more or less.
Nothing wrong with that. So here's my follow-up to, it's interesting because, as someone who was an athlete, I tried to get my daughter to play sports and it didn't take, and she went she went down the road of dance. And I learned to love it. I learned to appreciate dance athletically. When I would watch dance, I came to watch it through the lens of an athlete, and I realized you start to realize how athletic dance can be and how
absolutely. I'm so glad you appreciate that. Thank you.
No, I learned to. I've watched a lot of dance. Fifth position, jeté, pas de chat. I know all of these.
Okay, look at you. Come through.
All right. So here's my question.
Okay.
How do you? Does your theater background play a role in you as an educator? Do you draw upon that background at times in your role now or in the past? And if you do, what role does it play?
First of all, 100%. It impacts everything as an educator. I firmly believe that no education is ever wasted. So though it might have seemed like I went on this meandering path, I think I'm talking about my dad a lot in this interview. I feel like he explains that a lot. Like I lost myself for a while and then, I found my way back to academics, but I think it all informed everything that is who I am. So there's a few key lessons that I feel like I could touch on here. The first, in the theater space, you never begin the work until trust is established. And I mean, even someone you don't have a theater background, you've probably heard the like jokes about trust falls and like all the dorky things that, theater kids would do, but it's very intentional because you're putting yourself in this high risk situation of a public performance. And you have to have ultimate trust that the person beside you has done the work and memorized their lines and knows their cues. And you're not going to suddenly be stuck on stage with them, not knowing what to do. And you have to like scramble in front of all these people and figure it out. So trust is so important. And so you build it. And then throughout every production I've ever been a part of, you need to rebuild it when it's broken. Like I've had many a a circle time after a performance where things are falling apart, there's a fight within the cast, a breakup happened or something, and you have to quickly work through that as a group so that you can keep moving forward, because it is hard to pull off a performance. And so I bring that into everything I do in the classroom, and how to build a community and how to take community building very seriously. The second thing I'd say is a deeper understanding of behavior and understanding why people do the things they do. Because when you get to the higher levels of theater training, so when I got to university and you get into understanding different methods, like, the Stanislavski method, and it really becomes about motivation. Every single thing a character does in a story, in a show, in a movie, they're doing it for a good reason. You've actually talked about this on your podcast, the introspection bias.
Right.
So I sometimes find I'll hear a colleague talking about, oh, this kid's doing this to be annoying. They're just doing it to get attention. And I'm like, no, there's usually something more positive that they're trying to get out of that situation. You're judging their actions based on your perception, but there's actually a motivation there. And I find I can get there a little bit quicker with kids. Improv is a big one. So yes and is the cardinal rule of improv, right? If you're on stage with someone and you don't have a plan and you're making it up as you go, you never want to block an idea based off your own discomfort. Or you're like, oh, I don't like that. That's stupid. I don't want to go in that direction. And I found that's made me someone who can amplify creativity and innovation, not only in my classroom, but it's almost even more important as I've moved out of the classroom and I'm working with colleagues, because it's a risk to try something new in your context. And so if someone comes to you with an idea and is like, I think I want to try this, even if your brain's like, oh, I've already been down that path, that doesn't work. You always yes and it, and you just advance that offer and you go with it. The last one I would say is just the interplay between the technical and the emotional. And that actually comes from more of my dance and singing background. It was the hardest thing I had to overcome as I got to the higher levels, was I couldn't get to the emotional place. My technique as a singer is, especially like more classical, like opera, was like perfect. Like it was at the point that I was never off pitch. I would have every word down, my phrasing, my breathing, it was all there, but it sounded mechanical. And so I was constantly looking for that deeper attachment to what I was doing. And I find that is the core of what makes it's like the je ne sais quoi, I think, of my practice. And I see it in other people too. It's just this feeling you have as a teacher in your gut that you're like, I'm doing all the right techniques as a teacher, but they're not here with me and I'm not here. And it's not real yet. And I always am looking for that feeling. Yeah.
That's really, that last part there really resonates with me for sure, just about how teaching can be such a technical and such a clinical exercise, but there is always that emotional side to, I mean, we've talked before about the emotional side of assessment, the emotional side of the experience for learners, the emotional side for the teacher as well. And I think being able to, in some respects, I suppose, be comfortable with that and know that that is a necessary part of the entire sort of holistic experience as a teacher, as a learner. I think that's really interesting. You drew some really interesting connections there for sure. I can
it reminds me of, do you know that well-known quote by Parker Palmer? I feel like everyone read it in their ed program, like, technique is what teachers use until the real teacher arrives. Like there's a piece of that, right? It's that little something extra that you just know it when you see it, but it's hard to teach a new teacher.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. I feel like there's a lot more to explore there with the theater background for sure. But I want to pivot now to the podcast, because one of the many reasons, Natalie, I wanted to have you on my podcast is to talk about your podcast, and listeners will make sure that you know how to sort of follow and listen in on the Edgy Crush podcast, because I really enjoy it, and you've had some great episodes, and certainly want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about that. So you're, of course, the host of that podcast. And one of the things that, I love about hosting a podcast is having the opportunity to speak with and to learn from so many, interesting guests. And you listed a few that I've had on at the beginning. So I'm wondering what some of your key takeaways are from your podcast so far. And maybe from whom did you learn those lessons? Like, what are some of the things that you've taken away so far in the episodes you've had?
Oh, gosh. I've learned so much. I keep telling people who ask something similar to this question, like, this is the best professional learning I could ever advocate for. If you want to just amplify your curiosity and your depth of understanding, start a podcast. And also it gives you a reason to talk to that person who's doing a keynote that you could potentially pay $400 for, or you could book them on your podcast and it's free promo. Pro tip. But if I had to try and sum it up, which is hard to do, I think I'll use the themes that the podcast hits on. And that's how I've been organizing the content on the website. So that might be helpful. So the big themes are innovation, equity, creativity, and change. And those are kind of woven throughout every single episode. So if we start with innovation, I've had a lot of episodes directly focused on it and some that just kind of happen to touch on it. But what I've been saying recently is that I've learned innovation happens in the space between people. And that's very different than where I started, which innovation was like a thing. It was like an epiphany. It was like, someone going off into a room and emerging with an iPhone being like, aha, I did it. Behold my innovation. And
Right.
that is not the case at all. And that comes, I've featured a lot of projects. So because I'm currently in a school setting, whenever I see a couple colleagues that have tried a new project or a new approach in their classroom, and everyone's raving about it, I ask if they want to talk about it and debrief, because then I can share it with my community and the wider community. And the reason they tried it is almost always that they had another person beside them. And they felt their confidence was bolstered to give it a try because they had like a co-conspirator with them to struggle through it. And then also, like Sarah Middenick, she's the CEO of the Downey Wenjack Fund. She talked about how their Legacy Schools program, which is to try and advance the goals of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission here in Canada, is built on a networked change idea. It's the idea that you build people into a network and then they feel they're connected to something, they have inspiration and a place to go if they have challenges, they're more likely to give it a try. And Jim Gray was another person I interviewed. He's almost 90 years old, one of the most inspiring humans I've ever met. He is like the founder of the oil sands here in Alberta. He's very, very financially successful, but very humble. And looking back on his whole life, he just distills his wisdom down to the most simple but elegant parts. And when I asked him what innovation means, he talked more about confidence. And it's funny because confidence, I find, comes from people working together. And he said confidence is fragile and it's the most precious commodity that we have. And we have the ability to completely shatter someone's confidence. So it kind of goes back to the improv thing I was saying, where if someone comes forward with an idea and is like, I'd love to try this, that is where innovation happens in that moment right there. Because if you're someone who has a position of authority and you say, yeah, that's, we've tried that, that's not going to work, that person's probably not going to come forward again with an idea. So it's like that interplay between people I'm finding is so crucial to innovation actually happening.
Yeah.
So that's a big takeaway. From the equity standpoint, that has been like when I launched the podcast, we were right in the heart of, the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement. We were all at home in quarantine. We had just watched the murder of George Floyd and all the protests. It was very heavily weighing on my mind. So I feel like it's just naturally come up in a lot of the interviews. And I'm finding that equity demands dialogue. And we're not very good at dialogue as a society. So if you want equity, I feel like that is the first thing to focus on. And the first interview that got me thinking about that was Pat Worthington. He's an HR specialist. And I talked about how do you manage conflict? Because that's my biggest fear in the workplace. I don't know how to address it. I tend to always make things worse. I have a horrible call out game. I get triggered and I come in hot. So he talked a lot about in those moments, it's so important to step back because we are very likely just firming down into our own assumptions and our own perspective. And we're not understanding the other person's like motivation and where they're coming from and what their intentions are. And it's so important to understand in those moments of conflict. And then talking to Jesse Thistle, the author of From the Ashes, which is a memoir about he's Métis, and it's about his time that he spent living on the streets, addicted to drugs, and how he worked himself out of that and is now a professor at York University. And he talked eloquently about everyone has a story, and it's our job as humans to get it right and to understand what that person's story is and to listen and to ask questions. And because we're now having this better understanding of equity, I realize that we have such little understanding of these other lived experiences if you're not a part of that privilege bubble. So dialogue is becoming really important to me.
So many listeners you can hear. I mean, you have had just some wonderful guests on and some great deep conversations. So I've again, thoroughly enjoy it. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is to just, to talk about some of the experiences you've had. The tagline or, the vision for the podcast is where we reimagine education, right? We crush it together with passion and purpose. So let me ask you this, given all of those inspiring guests that you've had and many of the key takeaways, if you were asked to put it all together and actually think about it this way. How would you reimagine education right now?
Well, how long do you have, Tom? Because
Well, we can have the extended version of the podcast
Okay.
at some point.
First of all, every time I hear that phrase now, it's become almost like, when someone says a word again and again and again, and it almost starts to lose meaning. I think there's a word for that. I feel like that's like the phrase reimagine education right now. I'm hearing it everywhere, and it almost seems like it is just a throwaway now. It's like, oh, reimagine. You just think of new ways. Yay, check. You've reimagined education.
Right.
I almost wish I had chosen the phrase like rebuild. Like it's a little bit more active. It's a little bit more like doing something. But if I had to choose,
let's rebuild. Let's rebuild
right
now.
If we were to rebuild education. Okay, well, the reimagining part, because yes, you do need a vision. And like the vision that I've landed on, I don't think is revolutionary. I think a lot of people are there too, where we have to shift from this industrial, like mechanical system that we've inherited from the past to more of an evolutionary biological ecosystem that is more iterative and ever evolving. And that seems, it's like, yeah, sure, that seems legit. We need to do that. But I think that means challenging things that we've never really challenged. Like we have to really let go of the need for standardization. We have to really challenge allegiances to power, and we have to accept the beginnings of like a true education. And I'm an etymology nerd. So the root word of education is educare, comes from the Latin meaning to draw out, to lead out. And I think education is always, it's still very something that is done to people that go through school, as opposed to something people create for themselves. And so that's the high level, like that's the reimagining. But then it's like, I could stop there and it's like, cool, then we really changed the game on that one. Like we need more creativity. We need less standardization. Wow, what a game changer. But how we actually do it is where I think it gets interesting. And I've been gathering, like, I can't like act like these are all my own ideas. I feel like I've just been cobbling bits and pieces together over the past year. And one of the biggest things I think we need to challenge right out of the gate is professional learning. I think it's really hard for teachers to go into a classroom and create something different if they've never experienced something different. And by that, I mean, we know learning is amplified when people have choice and voice and they can go after it and they can choose something and they can work with others. I mean, just based off what I learned, from my podcast, people are more likely to take risks, to be more confident if they have another person beside them and they're choosing to do something. So if professional learning was completely unfettered, where every teacher had the opportunity to try something different, the goal is, okay, this year, just try something different and find someone to do it with. That's it. I have complete trust from all the teachers I know and I've worked with that they would take the reins on that, and they would go so far beyond what any administrator or leader thought was possible. But I think there's a lack of trust that still exists and a bit of fear. And so that the power of needing to control that experience is still there. So I think that's step one. And then I think we have to change what is variable in school. So right now, the what is the constant. This is the curriculum. This is what you have to learn. So if we flipped that and said, okay, that's variable, people are going to have way more choice and voice over what they learn, but then the constant becomes how we learn. Everything unravels at that point then, right? So I know we've talked about the competencies a lot. People have heard that before, but what I think is unique about the competencies is they're not often talked about like as they need to exist in their context. So it'd be really cool if every school, and this is the purpose part of like passion and purpose, had a chance to take an entire year and to say, what is your portrait of a learner? Who is the learner that you are creating? Forget about your curriculum, just put it over there. Who is the learner? And you only get like 4 to 6 overarching, learning goals that you're working towards and that this student should demonstrate by the time they graduate from your school. They clarify what those are, and then everything starts to get based around those. And then this is where I'm really starting to I'll go off. No more courses. I think we get rid of courses altogether and we move to a truly project-based approach where teachers, if they're in this really fluid professional learning model, can then say, okay, this term, me and this guy, he's a PE teacher, I'm a math teacher, but we have this crazy idea. We just saw this thing in the news. We're really fired up about it. We think we could do a really cool project where students are analyzing the budget of something that relates to PE. I can't think of it off the top of my head. I should have picked contents I actually understand a bit better.
It's all good.
So the students then can see all these different projects that different teams of teachers have organized around and say, okay, I want to do that project this term. Off they go. And maybe it's fluid between grades. So this happens at a junior high and a high school level. And what is measured and then what is reported is those learning attributes that the school has identified as most important to them. And they're then the whole scheduling would start to fall apart. So you might have really fluid times for how that project needs to ebb and flow throughout the term, but there might be fixed times. Like the question I can't quite answer yet is what would be those fixed blocks that just have to happen that are so integral to learning. And mentor time. I just had an amazing conversation with a group of grade 12 students last week about assessment. And they said having a mentor was a game changer for their own self-assessment, because when they trusted that person and that person said, tell me about how your learning's going, where do you want to grow, what's your goals? If they didn't trust them, they wouldn't tell them because they were embarrassed and they didn't want to look stupid. But they said, if you could choose that mentor and it's a teacher, maybe you had them in grade 8 and you're now in grade 12, but you still have such a tight connection, it would really amplify learning. And I also think something that should be fixed is, and this goes back to my theater world, like a community block, for lack of a better word, where people that are maybe working on that project together, or maybe it's crossed groups of kids, come together, they have circle meetings, they constantly go back, rebuild trust, work through problems that they're experiencing, and learn how to build those social skills and norms of truly listening in dialogue to understand one another and everyone else's experiences. So that's just a little taste. I could go way deeper, but I feel like
I know you could, and I think you're right. Though I mean, the hard part, of course, is trying to imagine the steps along the way. How do we get, for example, how do we get teachers feeling comfortable with a more ambiguous kind of job assignment, and all of those things that would take some detail. But I think that you're onto something in terms of the idea of the learner being at the center of the experience, and trying to change the constant, right? So right now, time is that constant. And we, a lot of us use the expression, when time is the constant, learning will vary. When learning is the constant, then time will vary. And because of that, you can start to reimagine. Now, speaking of reimagine, you touched on this a little bit, and I wanted to pick up on that. You talked about assessment and your conversation with those grade 12 students. So let's pick up on that. I happen to know that you obviously have a passion for assessment. You have a level of expertise in assessment, I would say. So when you think about assessment itself, and I think, again, you touched on this a little bit with standardization, what are some current assessment and grading paradigms that you feel need to be reimagined?
Oh man, I feel like that whole vision that I just described completely hinges on the assessment system.
Okay.
So if you had a traditional assessment system, none of all of that I just described is possible.
Right.
So basically everything has to be reimagined. And I think one of the first places we can start is blowing wide open the idea of how we gather evidence of learning. I think there's a bit of a traditional allegiance to like the test, the quiz, those are more, objective. And if instead we opened it up and said, okay, well, we're looking for these more holistic learning attributes as the outcome. We're now not looking at the content as the outcome. That's variable because that's based on preference and choice. Right. So we could look at, it's endless. Like it could be a podcast. It could be a TikTok. I tweeted something last night where I'm like, it's really hard describing a complex concept in 60 seconds. Luckily, TikTok is a 60-second video platform. Why not use that? So I think blowing open how we gather evidence, expanding our repertoire of evidence. And another piece is, because there's always a purpose for summative judgment, we have to report back to parents. Thus far, how are we doing? But I think empowering students in that process, I'm super excited about things I'm seeing on that front. So allowing them at the end of a project to co-create that summative judgment through dialogue, because that's so important, with a teacher and with their peers would be really powerful. I'd love to see self-assessment explored a little bit more. From my experience, people still approach it as just recruiting students to mark their work once in a while. And I've done a deep dive over the past couple of years into self-regulated learning. And I think we all need a better understanding of what that means and how to align assessment opportunities at each phase of the cycle. Because as you know, it's a 3-phase cycle. You've got planning, you've got monitoring, you've got reflecting, and we're missing out those first two often, the planning and the monitoring. And being in a special ed context, that's everything. We have to chunk everything down to the smallest point and then check for understanding. Even at the beginning, do we understand what the task is? Let's all get that straight first. I would love to see others adopt that mindset. And just feedback. We've talked about this before. I feel like that is something that it's widely, I'm doing air quotes, understood. It's something that I see on social media a lot, like shown as an infographic or a quick little checklist. It's timely, it's actionable, it's specific. And everyone's like, yes. And what I see missing often is the understanding between both people, the teacher and the student. And you can only get there through dialogue.
Yeah.
So I would love to see feedback as more of like a mentorship opportunity, as a coaching
Right.
opportunity, as a
Mm-hmm.
me and you sitting down, and hopefully I'm asking more questions than I am telling, and you're able to end it
Right.
what your next steps are yourself.
Yeah. Well,
And
you're speaking my language, Nat, because when Cassandra and Nicole and I wrote Essential Assessment, we talk about student investment occurs when the self-regulation of learning and assessment have a symbiotic relationship. And the idea that the assessment cycle can feed the opportunity for students to be self-regulatory about their learning. And as a result of helping students become more self-regulatory, the assessment results start to show. So you start to see students improve in their learning, right? And feedback as well, the important part. We definitely will have to continue our assessment exploration maybe in an episode to come. But I want to finish. I want to take a bit of a tangent here because you recently tweeted something. So I'm going to give you a bit of a platform here, Nat, because you tweeted something that caught my attention. And I thought, when I saw the tweet, I thought, I want to ask Natalie more about that. And then I thought, well, I'm going to have her on the podcast, so I might as well ask her on the podcast. So I think it was about a week ago, or maybe a few days ago, you tweeted this. You said, quote, "The more powerful, successful, and happy a man becomes, the more people trust him. The more powerful, successful, and happy a woman becomes, the less people trust her. Of all the things this culture has taught me, I most want to unlearn this," end quote. So, Natalie, can you unpack that for us?
Oh, yes. There's so much to unpack there. Yeah, this is a pivot. Okay, let's go there. So I feel like I have to tell you a bit of the story behind how the tweet came to be, because I use my Twitter truly as like my little idea dumping ground. I don't always have things totally fleshed out, but I'll have this spark of an idea and I'll leave it there so that I could go back in the future and hopefully turn it into a piece of writing. And I was reading 2 books at the same time, which I don't often do, but I was. One of them was Untamed by Glennon Doyle. And the other book is Think Again by Adam Grant. And as I was reading both of those parallel, this tweet popped into my brain because Glennon Doyle's book is a memoir, and it's very much a feminist memoir because she left her marriage after her husband had cheated on her. She discovered, realized she's a lesbian and, ended up in this very public relationship with a famous soccer player. And so it's her negotiating all of that and all of her addictions and her health issues and realizing how much was conditioned from the society that she was living in. And she talks a lot about, the lack of trust that you feel as a woman. So that's where that part came from. Okay. And then I'm reading Adam Grant's Think Again, which is about unlearning and the idea that we all have all these unconscious biases in our brain that we're just going through the world with that aren't serving us. And we have to actively rethink. And those two things came together for me because what I understand of systems of oppression, and we all know, we're living in a patriarchal system. It's no surprise to anybody. It's the history that we have brought along with us from the past. And though it's not as overt, just like racism, sexism has just mutated and evolved. So it's a little bit more nuanced than maybe it was in the 1950s. And my understanding of these systems is that there's 4 levels of oppression. There is the ideology, there is then the institutional level of oppression, then the interpersonal, and then the internalized. And the internalized is the part that has been plaguing me and keeping me up at night a little bit because I often feel like I want to go big and I want to fight the ideas and I want to fight the man. And usually that just ends up poorly for me. And so then I've been checking myself on the thoughts that I'm telling myself, like, especially as I've moved out of the classroom. That's a big shift for a teacher. Anyone who's done it, people look at you a little bit different. The trust is just a little bit different. Yeah. Trying to have a platform around something like assessment, which is already such an emotionally laden topic, is hard. And then you feel like, as a woman, is it harder because I'm a woman? And then you wonder if it's those thoughts that are actually causing you to feel that way. Because I'm thinking they don't trust me. If Tom comes to talk to my school, being a middle-aged white man, he's going to be better received than I am as a younger white woman. Is that me coming up with that? This is like our society conditioning me to feel that way? So I think that's where that tweet came from. Is it something that just really plagues me? And I wish I could condition my own brain to be more confident and get rid of the imposter syndrome sometimes.
Well, listeners, I hope you recognize now why Natalie is on the podcast. why I've invited her here. Her podcast, her work in education, and she is simply a deep thinker. And I really, really appreciate hearing from you. And your tweets often catch my attention, and I want to know more about the story behind many of your tweets, and that's why that one caught my attention. And I wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of explore that. So I appreciate that, Natalie. It's a vulnerable place to be too when you express yourself in that way, and I certainly appreciate that. So this is a good time to maybe pivot to something a little lighter. To have some fun here a little bit. As you know, I finish every interview with a segment called 3 Questions, where I ask just some fun questions that give people a chance to get. Although I feel like people got to know you quite well in this interview, we're going to get to know the other side of Nat. The fun side. We're going to ask 3 lighthearted questions. Then, of course, I've got one more question at the end. So here's the first question: what is the one superpower that you would most want to have?
Oh gosh. Superpower. Ugh.
Take it wherever you want.
Okay. I feel like I wish I could hack the like chemical makeup of my brain to just always be firing dopamine.
Well, I never I thought maybe like I would fly, like, Superman. Or,
yeah, I know. I went there and I was like, no, that's too obvious. Don't say fly. Yeah.
Right.
Just like constant dopamine brain girl.
There you go. I like that idea. That's good. Now, obviously, during second question, obviously, listen, during COVID, we could all use a vacation right now. So if you could travel to anywhere in the world right now for a 2-week vacation, money, no object. So we're not limited by budget here.
Man.
Where would you go?
I've never been to Europe, and it's like shocking. I'm Italian. My dad was born in Italy. I would go to Europe for 2 weeks and like do it all. I'd want to see like all the major cities and walk around and meet people and talk to people and just be around people again. Desperately.
Okay.
But in Europe. Yeah.
In Europe, you'd head to Europe. Okay.
Yeah.
That's good. All right. Question 3. What is for you one of the most overrated movies of all time?
Uh-oh. Oh man. Overrated. I've only seen it once. Every man listening to this podcast episode, Tom, is about to hate me if I say this, but it's what I truly believe. And you asked me a feminist question, and now I'm all fired up.
There you go.
It's Scarface. I'm sorry. I really don't. Right? I'm like, there's not a single guy that isn't like, oh, La Miguel, like, I can't even try to do it. But I feel like I hear the accent constantly from guys, and I've watched it a few times, and I'm like,
Say hello to my little friend.
That's it.
That's the quote. Yes. Okay. Well, you're allowed your opinion.
For me, half of them gone. Cool.
That's right. Interview over. Thanks for coming, Nat. No,
bye.
for me, it's Howard's End, 1992. On paper, it checks all the boxes. Anthony Hopkins, Vanessa Redgrave, Emma Thompson. I think it had somewhere around 8 to 10 Academy Award nominations. Oh. Emma Thompson won Best Actress.
Howard's End. I've never even heard of it.
I fell asleep.
Well, that's probably why.
Yeah. I did not enjoy it. Totally overrated to me. 1992. So that would have been a little before your time, right?
Oh, okay.
In terms of
I was alive.
Yes, I know that. But in terms
I was probably watching Care Bears for sure. Yeah.
Exactly. That's what I'm talking about. All right. So one final question, Natalie. I've asked this of everyone I've interviewed. And really, it's a theme running through the podcast about success and happiness. So interested in your perspective on the question of success. So if a random person stopped you on the street right now and asked you the question, what's your definition of success? How would you answer them?
Well, first of all, I have to say this is a great question to ask everybody, because as someone who was just part of a strategic planning task force, so a massive community of parents, students, teachers answering the question about where are we trying to get with our school? What does success look like? Everybody answers this question so different.
They do. They do.
I can see why you ask it.
Yeah.
Like I said, educator father. I feel like full circle. Let's just bring Papa Mo back into the mix here. The first book he ever bought me, and he's not really much of a reader, so this is a big deal for him, was The Element by the late Sir Ken Robinson. And that stuck with me very, very early on, this concept of finding your element. So that unique place where passion and aptitude align. And for me, that is like the heart of success. If you can find what that element is, you just completely come alive. You feel energized. And when you feel good, you naturally want to make other people feel good and you want to support them and help them. It's like the idea of putting your oxygen mask on first, right? So for me, definition of success would be living in your element.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. It's,
Mhm.
yeah, so many times. I love the idea of in your element, and therefore for others, you can bring a
Mhm.
kind of a positivity and success and influence to
Yeah,
other people. I love that.
completely.
We are definitely going to have to do this again. I really enjoyed our time together, Nat. Listeners, you definitely should follow Natalie on Twitter. Her Twitter handle is at Natabasso. So it's NATABASSO. You follow her on Twitter. You can also follow the at EduCrush Pod. That's on Twitter and also on Instagram. You can follow both of those as well. And also the website, www.educrush.com is the website for the podcast. Natalie, any other platforms to share?
Nope. I'm
No,
mostly on Twitter. As
mostly on
Tom
Twitter.
pointed out, I tweet a lot. So
Absolutely,
you can find me there.
and definitely a good follow. You definitely put out some thoughtful tweets that get me thinking and get others thinking for sure. And I see some of the responses to that. So Natalie, this was a lot of fun today. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Tom.